Hello and welcome to Utopian and Dystopian Fictions, a podcast hosted by me, Matt Leggett, a senior lecturer at the University of Winchester, where I teach utopian and dystopian fiction.
And me, Liam Knight, an independent scholar who holds a PhD in English literature from the University of Birmingham.
In each episode, we interview a different scholar, thinker, or writer, asking them to help us myth bust commonly held assumptions about utopias and dystopias.
If you like what you hear, please let us know by following the podcast, rating it on Spotify, or dropping us a message on utopian and dystopian fictions at gmail.com.
So, Liam, you're on recording duty this time round. Who have you been speaking to?
Well, Matt, in this episode, I had the pleasure of sitting down with Dr. Athira Unni, a freshly minted PhD and a scholar whose work spans continents, cultures, and critical frameworks. Athira's academic journey has taken her from Kerala to Buffalo, Hyderabad to Leeds, and her research reflects that global perspective. She's deeply engaged in utopian studies, feminist theory, and postcolonial literature, and the interview with her was nothing short of illuminating. So one of the first things that really struck me in our conversation was Athira's emphasis on the political power of literature. She spoke about reading 1984 in a book club during her undergrad and how its overt political messaging resonated with her more than other forms of speculative fiction. That experience sparked her interest in dystopian writing and led her to explore how similar themes manifest in South Asian and Caribbean texts. Now, Athira's research brings together novels like Before She Sleeps by Beena Shah and Escape by Manjula Padmanabhan from South Asia, alongside Caribbean works like Nalo Hopkinson's Midnight Robber. What unites these seemingly disparate regions, Athira argues, is a shared post-colonial history, bureaucratic dystopias, and rich folkloric traditions that shape their literary landscapes. These texts often depict societies marked by layered oppressions, so colonial remnants, caste hierarchies, gendered labour, and so on. And they use dystopian or speculative fiction to interrogate those realities. We also discussed how colonialism and its aftermath are represented in these works. Athira pointed out that while colonialism itself may not always be the central dystopian force, its legacies, like symbolic remnants of infrastructure or bureaucratic figures, often haunts the fictional worlds that these novels depict. For instance, in Escape, there's a railway system that exists only as a geographical marker, and there's a postmaster character who embodies colonial bureaucracy. A major theme in Athira's work is social reproduction theory, a Marxist feminist framework that examines the labour involved in sustaining life, so care work, education, domestic tasks, and so on, and how this work or labour is often undervalued or made invisible. She explained how this theory helps us understand dystopian societies, not just through their political systems, but through their treatment of labour and public spaces. Athira's analysis brings it to the forefront, showing how dystopian hyperbole, so exaggerated but plausible scenarios, can reveal deeper truths about societal structures. She also compared Atwood's work with Mahasweta Devi's Breast Giver, a social realist story about a wet nurse who nurses 40 children. And when we were discussing this text, we thought that although Atwood's dystopia is widely recognised, Devi's story, though equally harrowing, is rarely framed as dystopian. And this comparison raises important questions about whose suffering is seen as dystopian and how race and geography might influence our interpretations. Towards the end of our conversation, Athira shared examples of utopian enclaves within dystopian worlds, spaces where social reproduction becomes a source of healing and resistance. In Midnight Robber, for example, the protagonist finds refuge among folkloric beings who nurture her through trauma. Similarly, in Island of Lost Girls, a teenage girl is rejuvenated through communal rituals and care. These moments suggest that utopia isn't always a grand vision, but instead can be found in small acts of care, solidarity, and resistance. This episode is packed with insights, and I hope it sparks new ways of thinking about utopias, dystopias, and the labour that sustains them or helps us to escape them. Athira's work reminds us that speculative fiction isn't just about imagining the future, but it's about re-examining the past and understanding the present. Matt, that's sort of my overview of the interview complete. But what about this discussion with Athira really stood out for you or resonated with you?
I remember one line in particular that stood out to me was when Athira noted that, from a Western perspective, most utopian projects are drawing on the energies of revolution, whereas for post-colonial works, the moment of independence is really like the point of rupture. So, fundamentally, there's some pretty serious differences rather between the kind of these sort of underlying utopian imaginations. I thought that was interesting. A bunch of other things, I thought that really sort of jumped out. I mean, one thing is that, as someone who's recently become a parent, I thought your discussion about gender expectations were really interesting. As a new parent, you really get to see firsthand how much social reproductive labor is involved. The stuff that I think is maybe invisible in everyday life otherwise. And you also get to see firsthand, I think, just how often it's women that are tasked with this. So, my perspective is that until we start changing policy and expectations around things as basic as paternity leave, we can't really be forward thinking in any great sense, because we're not really able to foster conditions in which men can be as involved in raising children as women are. So you're starting out with a massive disadvantage. I'm speaking here, of course, particularly from a UK perspective, because I know that it does differ around the world. But, in the UK, the average period of maternity leave taken by women is 39 weeks compared to an average of less than 2 weeks for men. So, so it's a massive discrepancy. So, I as a new parent, I find that particular part of the conversation really interesting. I know you said to me earlier that you'd also been dealing with children over the weekend. Is that right?
Yeah. So I had family visiting, and sort of, I had my big niece came and stayed over with me for a night as well during that, and sort of my first experience really of being like not a parent, but sort of being fully responsible for a young person, a young family member. And I'm still exhausted, quite frankly. I don't know how parents do it, and I asked this to my brother-in-law, and I know I sort of made a similar comment to you. I don't get how parents do it. It's crazy, the just amount of labor or like attention span that young people, children sort of need. It's exhausting. It's made me rethink what I want for the future for me. But yeah, there's certainly a lot of labor there, and I think that's. I was thinking, especially when I asked Athira about the differences in gendered expectations with regards to social reproductive labor. I was thinking about sort of you as my co-host and thinking, well, hang on, like Matt's just become a dad, and is this something that is necessarily is it something that is it a labor that only women conduct, or do people of all genders conduct it, or what are the differences with regards to how people of different genders are treated when they conduct such labor? And so that was just a really interesting sort of sort of aspect of the interview for me.
I just to go back to the interview, the other things that sort of stood out to me, I'm not an expert, certainly by any stretch of the imagination, on sort of South Asian fiction. Embarrassingly, know very little. So I thought, it was great to hear someone who knows their stuff in this, and particularly sort of utopian and dystopian fiction from India. I know relatively little. So I kind of would have to talk about the only texts I know. And actually, obviously, if listeners want to explore more examples, you should totally listen to the interview. Of course, she's much better versed than I am. But one which didn't come up in your discussion, but which I am familiar with, was Rokeya Hossain's Sultana's Dream, which is a really interesting piece of short fiction published in 1905. It's a feminist science fiction utopia set in a place called Ladyland, which kind of tells you probably what you need to know about it. And it's a place which technology or technological advancements really have allowed women to replace men as the dominant gender, and they sort of keep men essentially locked away in a sort of reversal of the dynamics of the moment, of the time and the place. And so, and this is, of course, about, 10 years really before Charlotte Perkins Gilman would publish Herland. So
Mm.
in some ways, we often think of, utopian fiction, dystopian fiction is kind of being led by this great Western tradition. But, there's plenty of evidence of this stuff out there around the world, preceding, of course, a lot of that Western fiction. And Hussein also later wrote a novella called Padmarag, which is about a woman who finds community in a woman-run school. And I just mention it as it's a more subtle utopian vision of a kind of more caring society, which places women at its heart and seemed, I thought, to chime with some of the discussion you had around the dynamics of care in the interview.
Yeah, Matt, like you, I can't confess to being super knowledgeable about utopias and dystopias from South Asia or from the Caribbean. And I know we joke often that the podcast is an excuse really to bloat our reading lists more fully. But that's why I'm really appreciative to have Athira's expertise here to sort of bring a number of texts to my attention, your attention, to the audience's attention. I know I've got Before She Sleeps by Bina Shah somewhere on a bookcase, but the rest of the texts that Athira discusses are ones that I am much less familiar with. And I think I've mentioned in a few episodes now that I have this interest at the moment in utopias and dystopias from outside the West or from outside the Anglosphere. And this is certainly helping me with that sort of passion project, interest, whatever we want to call it. What else about the interview stood out for you?
Just one final thing I think I'd mention was, again, this is a kind of broader subject you were talking about. I mean, touched on, I suppose, but I think you had a fairly lengthy discussion about this. Is there sort of overlap between dystopian fiction and history, or historical fiction, or these kinds of things? And I thought it was one area I found particularly interesting because I think there's a lot of troubling dystopias, of course, that arise out of stories of African slavery, where reproductive labor was essentially stolen by slavers, so that, as you mentioned, sort of wet nurses were commonly forced to feed the children of white families, often at the detriment of the enslaved mother's own children. And you get some really interesting crossover narratives, I think, like, for example, Octavia Butler's 1979 novel Kindred, or Toni Morrison's 1987 novel Beloved, which in some senses just they feel deeply dystopian, although they're sort of dystopia adjacent, but which are kind of really mobilizing real history to tell their stories of oppression. And I just thought there was, an interesting chat in the interview with Athira about The Handmaid's Tale also, which sort of felt relevant to this. And the discussion also made me think of Joanne Ramos's 2019 novel, The Farm, which blurs that line, that distinction between dystopian fiction and commentary. Is that one you've come across?
Bought but not read. Tell me more, Matt.
How many books have you bought but not read?
Far too many. Far too many.
You got to work through them. It's about women living at an expensive surrogate farm in Massachusetts, and the protagonist is a Filipino woman who's paid to carry the baby of a particularly wealthy client. So apparently, Ramos, who's a Filipino-American novelist, was inspired to write the book after coming across an advert for surrogacy services in India, where surrogacy agencies are cheaper, which led to sort of wealthy couples choosing Indian mothers to carry their children.
Wow.
So, likewise, it was also inspired by our encounters with sort of Filipino workers in the US, which is where, of course, much of the social reproductive labor is carried out by poor immigrants who work as maids, nannies, etc., in those kind of wealthier households. So I thought it was a really interesting kind of crossover text that's kind of working on that, both reproductive labor but also sort of social reproductive labor. That text sort of sprung to mind. It's a really good read, actually. I would recommend you get to that one.
Yeah, I'll add it somewhere in the huge list. Some books are just decoration, right? But no, I probably should be reading them. I should buy less than I am currently doing at the moment. No, excellent, Matt. Thanks for that. I suppose we've talked around the interview a fair bit. How about we pass over to Athira herself?
Absolutely. Let's get that jingle.
So in this episode, I'm delighted to have with me Athira Unni, Athira, do you mind introducing yourself to our audience?
Hi, I'm Athira Unni. I grew up in a small socialist state called Kerala in India. I moved to Buffalo, New York for my undergrad. I did my BA English and BA Sociology along with a creative writing certificate in Buffalo. So I started writing for research and creatively during my undergrad. And then I moved back to India for my master's and work. So I did my master's in English literature from University of Hyderabad in India. So the big difference I found was in Buffalo, there was a lot of non-canonical focus where you read a lot of contemporary literature. And in Hyderabad, there was a lot of canonical focus. We were reading all the classics. And yeah, it was very different in that way. I worked for a bit, and then I did my PhD in English from Leeds Beckett University in the UK. So I have some teaching experience in Buffalo, Pune, Bangalore, University of York. And my previous research, like before I got into Utopian studies, I was working on Middle Eastern literature. My undergrad thesis was on Middle Eastern literature. And my PhD proposal was developed during the pandemic. So I started thinking about dystopian writing and about how the world is turning dystopian and everything, with a lot of factors involved, obviously, but especially during the pandemic. And I developed my PhD proposal during that time. So I discovered Utopian studies. I read Tom Moylan, Lucy Sargeson. I was mainly interested in the feminist aspects of Utopian studies. So you have a lot of writers writing about, obviously, reproductive labor, but also how the control of education or control of public spaces matter in feminist discourses. So I was interested in all that. And I developed my thesis in Leeds Beckett under Professor Susan Watkins and Professor Emily Zobel-Marshall. They guided me, and my thesis was on utopianism and social reproduction. So that's basically my so-called area of expertise.
No, thank you, Athira. And I know you only recently had your graduation, so newly minted doctor. So congratulations, and really happy and excited to have you with us today. It sounds like you've had a truly global education, and really looking forward to hearing some of your thoughts and your insights today. You've been kind enough to share some of your writings with myself and Matt, sort of in the build-up to us chatting. And I noticed that across your writings, where we're talking about utopian and dystopian literature, I noticed that you focused on novels and works from South Asia and the Caribbean. What drew you to literature from those regions in particular?
Growing up in India, I had not read a lot of Indian literature, except literature in my mother tongue, Malayalam. But I had not read like the classics by Tagore, for example, until undergrad. So you grow up with English literature, knowing a lot about English history or American history, and then you go back into focusing on whatever you've learned, and you go back to sort of focusing on what is relevant to you or to people you know. So that's how I came back to reading a lot of South Asian literature. And I realized that, so I read Orwell's 1984 in undergrad in a book club. It was not part of our course as such, but we read it in a book club, and there were so many diverse opinions. Like some really hated it, some really loved it. Like for me, I thought the writing was so political that I was so engaged in it. Like it engaged me to an extent that other science fiction did not. Like, for example, I'm not saying that it's not political, but like if I had to choose something that would be political, I would choose like a utopian or dystopian, writing. So for me, I think those aspects reproduced in South Asian context was very interesting to me. So when I realized that there were novels coming up in 2007, 2008, where people were writing, so Prayag Akbar's Laila is an example of a novel from India, which is very dystopian. Before She Sleeps by Beena Shah from Pakistan, another example. So when I moved to the UK for my PhD, I also discovered the Caribbean novels that were very similar. to this. So my research was basically shaped by discovering all these and sort of putting them together. Yeah.
Yeah, that's amazing. I sort of love hearing that, you know, it was the political element of 1984 that really spoke to you, but then you sort of identified that similar sort of preoccupation in sort of utopian or dystopian works from South Asia, and then noticed it also of the Caribbean. I suppose a question is, you know, those are, you know, or at least, you know, from a uneducated person's perspective, which might be my own, South Asia and the Caribbean, they seem quite disparate locations. But as you said, sort of you brought them together in your thesis. What sort of unifying thread for those two sort of regions and their literatures did you find?
Yeah, so there are two aspects that bring them together, actually. One is the shared postcolonial history. So you have South Asian postcolonial history sort of providing this background for all the utopian and dystopian writing. So you have, in Lela, for example, there are like really high walls that separate communities. And some of these walls are separating British bungalows and mosques and temples and everything from different communities, residential areas. So you have a history of the post-colonial background, like playing in with the world building and everything, but also there's bureaucracy. Bureaucracy is a huge factor in my work. So like there's a lot of bureaucratic dystopian aspects in these societies. So when you think about the Caribbean, there's a lot of mythical aspects, like a lot of folklorish elements and mythical aspects that come in. Same with South Asian, where you have sort of mythical aspects coming in and building this. Like there's a lot of world building that goes on with post-colonial histories as well as local folklorish histories, which bring these different, like really different contexts, but together. And there's also the history of South Asian indentured labor in the Caribbean. So there's some a bit of a connection that way as well.
So following on from that, then I suppose I'm thinking now about sort of the colonial histories of both regions, and we've already mentioned Orwell, which is, you know, big tick. We're on the Utopian Dystopian Fictions podcast, and Orwell's been mentioned. That's great. You got in there early. Well done. I'm thinking about like Burmese Days, you know, and Orwell's writings on sort of or recreation of you know colonial or colonialism sort of in full force. I suppose my question there would then be: do texts from the two regions we've discussed, do they sort of mirror or represent sort of the dystopian reality of colonialism for sort of the locals?
I don't think colonialism as such. I think it's post-colonial in a very apparent way. So there's this series by Manjula Padmanabhan. It's called, the first book is called Escape, and the second book is called Island of Lost Girls, and I think she's working on the third book now. But the idea is that there's a post-nuclear South Asia, and it's very interesting because the first book sort of gets the idea going that there's like this trans girl who's like the only remaining female in the whole of the continent, because there was a femicide after there was cloning, because there was no need for natural reproductive labor. And so there's a femicide, and there's this girl who is the only surviving girl, and she has to dress like a boy, and she has to travel from the country to the outside of the country. And then in the second book, there's the labor of rejuvenating her in an island of only women, who like kind of teaches her that she is a female and she is a woman. So it's interesting, but it's also very it's post-colonial, because the generals who actually engineer this femicide is kind of modeled on a white militia sort of the blueprint for that is that. And there's also an argument that it's also based on caste, which is also true. but then you have these layers of oppression. You have these layers of caste, upper caste, as well as colonial history, and you have racial history within the South Asian continent. So you have a lot of those factors playing in. And in my thesis, I sort of contextualize these factors, as well as compare this book to the Caribbean, to the Caribbean text, like one of the Nalla Hopkinson's novels. And she basically does the same thing with the, not Brown Girl in the Ring, the other one, The Midnight Robber. So The Midnight Robber, she has this girl sort of escaping one dimension and going to another dimension, and sort of escaping this her rapist father. So there's a familial sort of like context as well, with a societal context. So yeah, so it's a bit like layered in a very heavy sense. So it's difficult to get through these layers. So another thing that I wanted to mention was how post-colonial, there are post-colonial remnants in the landscape. So in Escape, in Manjula Padmanabhan's novel, for example, there is the remnant of the railway system. So you have the rails still there, but in a post-nuclear landscape, you have bullock carts sort of flying through the rails. So it's only a geographical marker. You know, you can get from one place to another. You can know kind of like that this is where the place is, and these are the landmarks kind of thing. But it's not a functional transport system, you know. So yeah, so it's the postmaster is a sort of symbolic remnant. It's a character in the novel as well, who is like a colonial bureaucrat still existing from those times. It's yeah, so it's there, but it's not apparent in the way that you would see if you don't look at the labor involved. So that's something that I was focusing on in my work. So for me, I think what really spells out post-colonial utopianism is labor and the histories of exploitation of labor. So you have specifically social reproductive labor. So you have this idea that there's the histories of labor sort of spell out how dystopian a society was, or how bad a society was in history or in contemporary reality. And then you have sort of layers of how this can be transplanted into fiction.
Thank you for your answer there. I think it's, you know, it sounds like novels written in or about these contexts, you know, about South Asia and the Caribbean. It sounds like they have, I said, like multiple layers of oppression that we're sort of really examining and interrogating. As you said, it sounds like it can be quite heavy. So, you know, sort of fair play for dealing with the hard stuff. Yeah, I think we're always dealing with the hard stuff with, you know, looking at utopias and dystopias, but there's yeah, lots of difficulty or heaviness there. You've touched on a little bit on what you see as being quite characteristic or core or traditional of sort of the dystopias from South Asia and the Caribbean, and as you say in your thesis introduction, and I'm quoting you to yourself, which is every academic stream, utopianism outside the West is of growing interest in the field of utopian studies. And so I was wondering if you could speak to any other traditions of utopianism or dystopianism, to sort of kind of make up a word, I guess, in sort of non-Western utopias or dystopias. I suppose I'm asking, you know, how else might dystopias written in or from or about South Asia and the Caribbean, how might they be further different or the same even to utopias and dystopias from the West that might be more familiar to myself and Matt and the audience?
There's definitely been growing interest, but I don't know if the traditions of utopianism and dystopianism have existed as in the way that, let's say, Thomas More's Utopia, and then there's like a tradition of utopian writing. So I don't think it's existed in that sense, but I think there's a different imaginative model, let's say. I think it's about like identifying where there has been Western utopian traditions that have been influenced by factors outside the West.
Mm-hmm.
So this has been something that I've been thinking about. For example, there's this novel by Aldous Huxley called Island.
Mm-hmm.
It's very multicultural. It has a lot of so-called Indian characters, and they have a lot of, so it's very confusing in that way, but it's also like interesting because you have this like very contemporary tradition of utopianism sort of developing in a very diverse sort of multicultural way. And then there are two observations I made in my introduction. One is that so in Lyman Tower Sargent's classification of three forms of utopianism, which I think is very interesting, he mentions this category of Oriental tales, which I think has a tendency to collapse a lot of stories under Oriental tales. So that's one. And there's another in which Tom Moylan's classification of revolution as a critical moment in thinking about critical dystopias. So if you think about it from a non-Western perspective, the critical moment is not usually revolution, it's independence. So you have a sort of different perspective from post-colonial viewpoint. And when you interrogate traditions of utopianism in the West, they usually think of revolution, not of the freedom of the post-colony. So so I think for me, like approaching those traditions and sort of thinking about labor, and within that, histories of labor exploitation and how that has shaped our thinking of like creating utopian traditions is something that's very resonates with me.
And I suppose that brings me to my next question, because we've sort of skirted around the topic of social reproduction theory a little bit already, and social reproduction theory features quite heavily in your work. And for those of us who are unfamiliar, like myself, prior to sort of reading your work, what is social reproduction theory in simplish terms?
Social reproduction theory is under the Marxist feminist framework, and it sort of begins as a wage for housework kind of movement. So there are these feminists writing about wage for housework, and they basically talk about how you have to think about the wage for housework movement as it's about thinking about housework as more of a social contract than a natural attribute. So this is what Sylvia Federici says in 1980, and she says its unwaged character, the housework's unwaged character, helps reinforce the idea that housework is not work, which is not true. So demanding wages for housework means recognizing that housework is not an expression of women's nature. So Sylvia Federici says that, and Nancy Fraser sort of backs this argument, and she says that social reproductive labor, which is basically all labor that reproduces the laborer. So in simple terms, social reproductive labor is the labor that gives birth, reproduces the laborer, nursing, cooking, cleaning, creating these social reproductive spaces, which are for education, schools, hospitals, gardens, prisons. You have all these social reproductive spaces where the laborer is rejuvenated, is reproduced or rejuvenated. So basically the labor power of the laborer or the utopian subject is reproduced. Now this needs to be thought about in contemporary terms as well. So Fraser notes that social reproductive theory, which is indispensable to society, for example, care work, including unwaged, effective, and material labor, has been cast as women's work. So you have the feminist aspect coming in there, but it's also a condition of possibility for sustained accumulation in capitalist culture. So you need to think about the capitalist culture as building a sort of pyramid on top of the base of social reproductive labor. So you have the capitalist tendency towards unlimited accumulation, tending to destabilize the very processes of social reproduction in which it relies. This is Fraser, I'm quoting Fraser here. Tidhi Bhattacharya, who sort of works in social reproduction as well, she builds on this, and she says she maps the class oppression in global patterns of contemporary capitalism and maps that into class struggle and social reproduction, and says that there are myriad social relations in homes, schools, and hospitals that sort of shape our capitalist totality, sort of. And there's a spatial understanding of this. There's a spatial understanding in which schools, hospitals, and prisons and gardens are sort of social reproductive spaces. So all reproductive labor, biological and social, sort of falls into social reproductive labor. So for me, I think I sort of started thinking about this during the pandemic. And you know how during the pandemic, there was like a sort of total breakdown between work and home spaces, right? So you have, so in the Victorian era, when there was like the idea of a workspace, or you go to a mine, or you go to an office and work, as opposed to, you know, having everything at home, or like working at home. So that sort of, that breakdown, that spatial difference sort of, you know, fell apart. For me, I think I started thinking about dystopian spaces in conjunction with that. So it brought together utopianism and social reproduction, which I found that nobody else had worked on. So I sort of started thinking about how the utopian subject is rejuvenated in social reproductive spaces. So for me, to build a better society, I would say that you focus on the social reproductive spaces, you focus on education, health, and you build a better public spaces. And all of this is also, the converse is also true. So you have authoritarian control over these spaces, and you have a dystopia. So it's really that, it's really about reproducing the laborer as a utopian subject, and how that labor that goes into shaping the laborer links utopianism and social reproduction.
Yeah, wow, thank you. That was like a crash course there, which I was definitely in need of. I've got like several follow-on questions for that, I think. So my understanding then is that social reproduction theory is any sort of work, labour that goes into making the labourer, the worker, especially under capitalism, and also the spaces that sort of either helped to create the worker or help to restore or rejuvenate the worker. But also I was thinking, because you mentioned prisons as well, and depending on one's thoughts on schools, they also kind of reform the worker as well, right? They sort of correct or coerce the worker. So thank you for that. That was brilliant. I know you said that this is like under the Marxist feminist framework. And I know that a lot of the works that you're citing, I know, given your interest in sort of feminist utopias and dystopias, there's a lot of link there to, I'm air quoting, like women's work, which traditionally, historically has been, it's the role of the mother to do X, Y, and Z, or the housewife, and etc. So you've already sort of answered one of my following questions, which is yes, it is related to feminist theory and feminist frameworks. I was wondering though, under just, in the 2020s, would it be, is social reproduction theory moving further away from that, only insofar as we have single fathers raising children, or dual fathers raising children, or just sort of non traditional, I'm using air quotes again, non-traditional sort of families where there are now men doing this labor too. So is that sort of a progression for social reproduction theory, or does that sort of challenge it too much?
Oh yeah, that's definitely something that's talked about in Titi Bhattacharya's book as well. So she talks about how race and gender inform social reproduction theory and how it intersect. So if you think about care work taken up by men at home, it's the same except that you might have some. So you have the workspace, you have the capitalist workspace, and then the social reproductive space. So you might have more understanding from the capitalist workspace that you have other responsibilities if you're a man. Sometimes that there's that difference, there's that bias that operates, as opposed to women who are expected to do that, and there's this understanding that, oh, this has always been like that or something. So if you consider that, that's one difference. And then there's also the idea that a lot of care work is done by people, women of color, and even in societies that do not pay well, or are not fair in terms of work hours or working conditions. So there's a lot of intersection between race and gender with social reproduction theory, and it's still a very evolving sort of study.
Yeah, no, actually, you what you're saying there about the gendered implication there, you're totally spot on. Actually, I was thinking, where it's almost like a meme, or almost just sort of a stereotype now, where if a mother is taking her children out to the park to play or something, it's like, oh, okay, it's just accepted. Whereas if the father does that, it's like, oh, isn't he a hero taking the kids out at the weekend? Yeah, so yeah, actually, you're right. There is still wrongfully this sort of gendered assumption that this is women's work, and if men are doing it, it's celebrated, or it's sort of, I don't know, it's more accounted for, more thought about. You've already sort of discussed a little bit about the insights that bringing a social reproduction theory into dialogue with utopia studies generates. I was wondering, actually, do you have anything more to add to that with regards to what sort of insights this brings to us in utopian studies?
Yeah, so there are so many actually, but I think it depends on the text that you're looking at.
Yeah.
So if you look at recently, the text Julia, the perspective, the women's perspective about 1984, sort of, I read it and I was thinking about how much of it is about reproductive labor, and a lot of it was just in the background, like you don't see it happening. For example, even in Atwood's text, Handmaid's Tale, you have the Marthas sort of cooking in the background, and it's an entire sort of cast, made up. It's named, and it's a uniformed cast, sort of carrying out the social reproductive labor in the background. And you have then the handmaids who are also uniformed and carrying out another type of social reproductive labor. So in chapter 2 of my text, I sort of take up Atwood's text and bring in a social reproductive lens to study her text. And I do add a few, I think about it in terms of the hyperbole. So for me, what interests me is that Atwood's text, how relevant is it to people of color? And it's a bit of a tricky question, because there has been obviously a lot of things written on it, especially by Donita Dodson, who has talked about Atwood borrowing tropes from 19th century African American slave narratives, the confessional mode and the underground female road. So I was looking at it in terms of how this is sort of like a layering of realities. So I take like a hyperbolic perspective. I think about this in terms of a construction called dystopian hyperbole. So dystopian hyperbole is something that appears in Atwood's text because she thinks of the narrative as from a hyperbolic perspective. Like it's taking a hyperbolic perspective on Atwood's dystopian novel is about reading the incongruity of grafting various narratives onto the plot. So you have the sort of like bizarre combination of historical reality sort of operating within the same text. So there's like a pastiche-like effect. So you have hyperbole and hyperbolic forms on their rhetorical effects, sort of materializing with a combination of narratives and historical influences. And she drafts or overlays narratives of oppression to construct the dystopia of Gilead. So the problem here is that all of this happens to a white woman, and whereas the real historical or contemporary events that are inspired or imagining historically has happened to people of color. So there's that disjunction, obviously, but these events become dystopian or unimaginable only in combination, whereas the overlaying is very important, like the grafting of these narratives becomes important. Whereas taken independently, these are just really terrible historical events. But when in combination, it just like becomes Gilead, right? So you have that impossibility, like turning up from the possible historical realities, sort of becomes the dystopian hyperbole effect. I also take like actual hyperboles from Atwood's text. Like there are instances where she uses hyperboles in the text to talk about reproductive labor. And one of the texts that I compared, the text that I compared with Atwood's text is a social realist short story by Mahashweta Devi called Breast Giver, where she talks about Yashoda, who is like a a wet nurse. She nurses about 40 kids during her lifetime. And this is a social realist story from India. And you sort of think about how this is like an individual dystopian tale where she goes through this reproductive labor, and how this is never seen as dystopian. Like it's never seen as a terrible sort of reality. So I talk about Atwood's novel and Marshita Devi's short story, and how there's the operating, like how dystopian hyperbole operates in both the texts, and how the hyperbole of nursing 40 children is like taken as the sort of the turning point in the story. Like it's the major aspect of the story that makes it dystopian. Right? So yeah, a bit of that. So I think there's like a lot to talk about in terms of social reproductive labor operating in many dystopian texts, but some of these things like allow us to sort of like contextualize texts from bizarrely different cultures, which I think is sort of interesting.
I think something that you said there is really just sort of light bulb moment for me, which is where you're talking about race and how in The Handmaid's Tale, Atwood has borrowed from, to be generous, so many sort of historical atrocities, and yet it seems to be only by sort of throwing all those atrocities and realities, there's realistic atrocities or and so on, only by sort of compounding several of those and contextualizing those within a white character, a white protagonist, that's where we see dystopia. And yet where we're seeing these, as I said, in the sort of the realist short story you're discussing there, like that is a real, that is a not like that could be real, that was real, right? That was somebody's life, that was somebody's experience. And yet even where that is narrativized, we don't call it dystopian, even though it's real and it's awful. And so there's a lot to be said there about, I suppose, is this where some of the value of social reproduction theory is that it allows us to look back, right? It bounces us back to not the dystopian imaginings, but to sort of the historical antecedents, if I'm using that word correctly, for them. And so we can re-examine elements of the past in reality to see how awful they may have been. Thank you for that. I had another follow-on question, only because when you were talking about, again, social reproduction theory, I was sort of trying to think, okay, where does this really spark for me in terms of dystopian texts or utopian texts? And I was suddenly really thinking about Brave New World by Aldous Huxley, second time he's been mentioned today, in that the social reproduction of the mother has been all but removed, apart from for John's mother, whose name I can't remember, and that's like seen as really horrifying and disgusting. And yet the social reproduction that's used to firstly make the citizens of the world state, but then also to condition them and to have them conform and fit into that society. Your discussion earlier of gardens kind of then also makes me think about the they play a form of tennis, don't they? And like they talk about how like all of the ephemera for the tennis is just meant to be like thrown away and captures and perpetuates. All of this is not a ramble, it is, but it's not intentionally a ramble. I'm thinking out loud. But here we see a dystopia be formed through really tight, rigid control of social reproduction. I am getting there, I promise. And we've spoken a lot about dystopian texts thus far. Have you encountered any texts that are dystopian, but in which social reproduction becomes the utopia or the way out of the dystopia?
That's a good question. So there are multiple texts, actually. So in Midnight Robber, which is Nalo Hopkinson's Caribbean text. I know I've been talking a lot about South Asian texts and Atwood and everything, but Midnight Robber, like in Midnight Robber, what happens is that the protagonist Tantan, she ends up in alternate dimension with Duan tribes. So Duans are part aliens, part folklorish beings. And these beings, through social reproductive labor, sort of rejuvenate her as a character and sort of nurture her. Like they basically nurture her through the trauma of running from her rapist and sort of killing her rapist and running from that. And yeah, so there are aspects in which social reproductive labor is used to rejuvenate the utopian subject. So you might also find that in The Island of Lost Girls by Manjula Padmanabhan, South Asian text. There also the protagonist, who is a teenage girl, is rejuvenated in an island of women where she sort of goes through rituals and she learns to defend herself. She takes part in this public childbirth ritual, which is also sort of like it's about how social reproductive labor is sort of seen inside that society, inside that utopian society. So there are utopian enclaves that where social reproductive labor operates. One of the things that I was thinking about while writing my thesis, what makes a utopian enclave a utopian enclave? Like usually inside a dystopian society, what makes a utopian enclave a functional unit is that it provides social reproduction in a rejuvenating sense. So you have the utopian subjects sort of coming in and engaging in like these normal activities where they either hang around in public spaces or like engage in cooking, cleaning, thinking about talking to other utopian subjects about tearing down the dystopian aspects, like not like changing the social reproductive spaces outside the utopian enclave,
Moving on, I was curious, and I'm aware we don't want to take up too much of your time today. I really loved reading your article on social reproduction theory and a couple of texts that you've mentioned already today. But I was wondering, with regards to utopian studies and its maybe related areas, what are you currently working on?
So I've been working on one article about nuclear imaginaries. So I think something that we don't really think about a lot in dystopian writing, I think, like at least in a very traditional sort of canonical way, is how after the post-1950s, there's been a lot of post-nuclear writing. And I'm thinking about nuclear imaginaries and how they intersect with the idea of nation. So you have the idea of nation sort of propped up by the idea of this dystopian nuclear imaginary, right? But you also have books in which the nuclear imaginary imagines a post-nation world where you have tribes or where you have like world governments. So that's one article that I'm working on. And another one is on eco-precarity in Vandana Singh's fiction, which is not exactly tied to dystopian studies, but sort of, utopian studies, but like it's a bit, it's tangential to it. Then I'm also working on my book proposal to turn my thesis into a monograph, which I hope works out. That's not, I'm still like working on the book proposal and sort of fine tuning it. So yeah.
Yeah, I having sort of started and stopped on several occasions book proposal, and having friends who are much further along that sort of journey than I ever got. I know that's an absolute grind. So good luck, and I hope something positive comes out from that. Final question from me, Athira, which is as part of the podcast, as I'm sure you're aware, and as I'm sure the listeners are, Matt and I always ask our guests to recommend some reading to us. Now, that reading could be literary or it could be scholarly. So if listeners wanted to learn more about maybe post-colonial, utopian, dystopian fiction, or social reproduction theory, or something that sort of brings all of those things together, what book or books or texts or whatever might you recommend to us?
So can I go by two? Like I want to talk about two books.
Go on, I'll let you go on then.
So the canonical one, like the one that you would read before you work on anything that's post-colonial utopianism, is called Postcolonial Utopianism by Bill Ashcroft. I think it's called Utopianism in Post-Colonial Cultures or Post-Colonial Literatures. So he talks about how the idea of utopianism in postcolonial cultures has been about progress rather than anything else. So you have a postcolonial society thinking about a better society, about building a better society, and how that's utopian. So in South Asian context, that has people turning to Gandhi and Tagore for a lot of utopian ideas, where Gandhi has talked about that how the world lives in villages and how it's a village-centered utopia that he has in mind. And for Tagore, it's a borderless world where you don't have national borders. So that's one book by Ashcroft. And Ashcroft sort of traces all these traditions of utopian thought. And although it's not fictional, it's not reflected in the utopian fiction as such. But you also have the Caribbean side of things, where you have a sort of archipelagic consciousness, which Ashcroft talks about. And he talks about how it's an archipelago, and you have these diverse cultures, Spanish, French, English, a lot of these cultures sort of informing the Caribbean notion of Caribbeanness, where you have it's not just about diversity as such, it's also about how to live with that diversity. It's about how to have those different set of folklore stories and cultures and languages sort of coming together to sort of make a better world. And that's about that's about Utopianism in postcolonial cultures. There's another book which was a discovery during my PhD. It's called Utopias of the Third Kind by Vandana Singh. And I think it's a great book. It's a very little sort of small, slim title. It has about it has one essay which is titled Utopias of Third Kind, and it has 6 or 7 stories, short stories by Vandana Singh. So she's a short story writer predominantly, but she writes about this idea of hers, which is about utopias of the third kind. So she defines it as being grounded in the local, in its geography and social, cultural, ecological surround, but locate themselves in a planetary context. So it's about this tension between the local and the planetary. And she writes about how local and planetary are not mutually exclusive categories, but are connected in space and time. So, so if you think about a classic, like a South Asian short story, sci-fi short story, then in recent times, I think Vandana Singh has written a lot of these short stories where she has sort of employed this idea of utopias of the third kind.
Amazing. Those are 2 really interesting sounding reads. I think, as I said to you before the call started, I've got this real interest at the moment from reading utopias and dystopias from outside the Anglosphere, and it sounds like more broadly, away from the UK and America and Canada, basically. So those texts might be some really good scholarly, critical reading, and then also sort of creative reading for me to dip into, to scratch that itch. But hopefully our listeners too will sort of go away after listening to you vouch for them, and will likewise find it to be really, really illuminating. Well, Athira, thank you so much for your time today. It's been hugely illuminating. I feel very lucky to be able to interview you today and to have this chat. And I hope our listeners likewise find it to be really interesting, because I have hugely.
Thank you so much, Liam. The questions were amazing. I just wanted to thank you and Matt for giving me an opportunity to talk about my work. Thank you.
No, you're very welcome.
Thank you to Athira for coming on to the podcast. Between her thoughts on South Asian and Caribbean texts, social reproduction theory, and dystopian hyperbole, I really learned a lot, and I hope you, dear reader, dear listener, did too. If you enjoyed this episode, you can let us know by rating and following the podcast, leaving a comment, or sending us an email using the address found in the podcast description. We've got some brilliant interviews lined up, and we would love for you to tune into them. So please join us next time, where we'll delve into some more utopian and dystopian fictions.